The Sega Saturn is arguably one of my favorite consoles of all time. I loved it as a kid and I still love it as an adult. I think it's just a fascinating system with a really cool library of unique Sega games that you really couldn't experience on any other platforms. And it's always been curious to see what games were the best selling on old systems. Now, of course, with the NPD being a big force on the internet, you know everything about sales figures in the United States when it comes to video games nowadays. But back then, there wasn't the outlet of the internet to sort of get this information out there. Well, Matt Piscatella is the head of NPD, which tracks sales figures for video game sales in the United States when it comes to physical sales. And today he put up a lot of classic consoles and what the best games on those systems were in terms of sales figures. And one of those consoles was the Sega Saturn. He listed the top 10 best Sega Saturn selling games of all time. So I thought it would be fun to look over this list because honestly, number one completely surprised me. I don't think anyone would have guessed what number one was, what the best selling Sega Saturn game of all time was. So we're going to go over this list, talk about these games, and then yes, we're going to talk about the number one selling Sega Saturn game of all time. So sit back, relax, make sure you subscribe to the channel, put what you think will be the number one selling game of all time for the Saturn in the comment section down below before we talk about it, and let's get into this list.
Hey, RGT 85. Hey, Sean.
Oh my God, it's Stevie Richards! So coming in at number 10 is a game that I think everyone would expect to be on this list, and that is the original Panzer Dragoon. Now this was a really cool game, an on-rails game where you were basically on the back of a dragon, and it plays sort of like Star Fox, but definitely a bit more advanced. A really breathtaking game at the time. It had a really great art style, a really great soundtrack as well, and of course this trilogy of games, Panzer Dragoon 2, and Panzer Dragoon Saga, are some of the most highly sought after Sega Saturn games, and it makes sense because they're some of the best games on the platform. So number 10 is Panzer Dragoon. Number 9 is World Series Baseball. Now that may actually come as a surprise to some people, but for me, I sort of predicted that this game would be on this list because this was a big and popular franchise on the Sega Genesis. A lot of people liked the World Series Baseball series over things like Triple Play, which was out there from EA, and it was a really well done baseball game. You know, the World Series Baseball on the Sega Saturn, the first one, wasn't all that great, I felt. I felt that 98 was probably the better of the World Series Baseball games on the Sega Saturn, but you know, it makes sense. A lot of Sega fans love the Sega Sports lineup of games, so World Series Baseball was the number 9 selling game of all time for the Sega Saturn. Coming in at number 8 is Sonic 3D Blast. Now, we never got the 3D Sonic game that we really wanted on the Sega Saturn, but Sonic 3D Blast was admittedly a decent game. It was a top-down isometric view that had Sonic trying to save little animals and things like that, and it was okay. Obviously, it was the same thing that you could get on the Sega Genesis, just the Sega Saturn version had improved visuals and, you know, better music and things like that due to the CD audio. But yes, we never got a 3D traditional Sonic game, so Sonic 3D Blast is number 8 on the list. Coming in at number 7 is a racing game, which is something that Sega was known for, and that is Sega Rally Championship. Now, this game is surprisingly still very playable in modern standards and in modern gaming. A really fun off-road racing game that just captures that classic Sega arcade feel that a lot of us know Sega for, and a lot of us appreciated Sega for. It was one of the reasons why we gravitated towards Sega systems, because of their awesome arcade games. So Sega Rally Championship was the number 7 selling game of all time. Number 6 is one of 2 third-party games that are on the Sega Saturn's all-time bestsellers list, and that is the original Tomb Raider. Now, the original Tomb Raider, of course, sort of got assimilated with the PlayStation brand as the subsequent games in the Tomb Raider series only released on the PlayStation and not the Sega Saturn, but the original Tomb Raider was a fantastic game. It was this 3D adventure game where you play as Lara Croft, going into all these different environments, trying to, you know, sort of doing like Indiana Jones style stuff. It was a really fun game. It was a really unique game. It was the first time in a long time that a female character had a really strong presence as a lead role in a game, so it sort of made sense. It was a very fun and stylized game at the time. Hasn't aged all that well, but the original Tomb Raider was the number 6 selling game overall for the Sega Saturn. Coming in at number 5 is another classic arcade game from Sega, and that is the original Virtua Cop. Now, this was a light gun shooter, and of course they ended up doing a light gun for the Sega Saturn. Light gun shooters were very popular during the mid to late 90s. It was sort of bringing home the arcade experience onto these 32-bit platforms. Of course, the PlayStation brand had Time Crisis. You ended up getting Virtua Cop 2. You also got House of the Dead on the Sega Saturn. But the original Virtua Cop, definitely a fantastic game. I think Virtua Cop 2 is the better game, but this is just talking sales figures. So Virtua Cop, the original, is the number 5 overall selling game when it comes to the Sega Saturn. Coming in at number 4 was a launch title for the Sega Saturn, a game that a lot of people were looking forward to, and a game that I hold near and dear to my heart, and that is Daytona USA. Now, yes, there were subsequent versions that were better on the Sega Saturn because the original Daytona USA was a rushed port to get out of the gate with the Sega Saturn when it launched in North America, but still, there is some nostalgic value to the original Daytona USA. It's still definitely a very fun game with a fantastic soundtrack that I absolutely love, and it's really well revered when it comes to things like the Sega Saturn. Once again, it's another great arcade game that was brought home to the Sega Saturn, and a Sega Saturn exclusive as well, like most of the games on this list, so I totally understand why it's on there. Coming in at number 3 is arguably the best fighting game on the Sega Saturn. I always think it is the best fighting game on the Saturn, and that is Virtua Fighter 2. Now, this was a damn good arcade port. Sega really took their time when it came to porting home the home version of Virtua Fighter 2, and I think it really shows because it's definitely a game from that era, a 3D fighting game from that era, that's still definitely very playable, still looks really good as well, is very fast and very fluid, and very close to the original arcade version of the game. I really loved Virtua Fighter 2. I still love Virtua Fighter 2, and because it's one of the best-selling games on the system of all time, it's pretty cheap to pick up as well. So if you don't have it on your Sega Saturn, I have to question why you're even collecting Sega Saturn stuff. But yes, Virtua Fighter 2 is the number 3 selling game on the Sega Saturn. Number 2, people, you did good. You did good. This honestly shocked me almost as much as number 1 did. Number 1 just completely shocked me to death. But number 2 on the Sega Saturn, the number 2 selling Sega Saturn game of all time in the United States was Knights. And that is absolutely fantastic to hear and see. We don't know, of course, how many units Knights sold, but it's great to see Knights on there because I think Knights is a fantastic game. And I love, the original Knights. I love Christmas Knights. I love even the Wii version of the game. Just don't play it with motion controls because it really ruins it. But Knights was a really unique game, and it was sort of the Sonic game on the Sega Saturn that we never got. Obviously, it was a 2.5D game where you go around collecting orbs and things like that, defeating bosses while trying to rid these nightmares from this world, and I just really enjoyed the game. I really love the art style and the colorful visuals in the game, so it's definitely awesome to see Knights as the number 2 selling game overall on the Sega Saturn. Now, when it comes to number 1, you might remember when I talked about Tomb Raider, I said that there were 2 games, third-party games, that were on this list. So obviously, number 1 has to be a third-party game on the Sega Saturn that was the best-selling Sega Saturn game of all time. And you're sitting there racking your brain, but you're never going to guess it unless you cheated and looked at what Matt Piscatella said on Twitter when he revealed this list. Because the number 1 selling Sega Saturn game of all time in the United States is Madden 97. Madden 97 is the number 1 selling Sega Saturn game of all time. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, what about the PlayStation list? He also released the PlayStation list, and Madden 97 was not the number 1 selling game on the PlayStation. There was no Madden 97 on the PlayStation's top 10 list. But when it comes to the Sega Saturn, Madden 97 was the top selling game in North America for the system. Now, I get it because, like I said, a lot of Sega Saturn owners and a lot of Sega fans in general liked sports games, but I didn't think they liked sports games that much. I would have thought Daytona USA would have probably been the number 1 selling game of all time if I had to guess, just because it came out at the launch of the system. It had that arcade game pedigree as well. But no, it's Madden 97 that is the number 1 selling Sega Saturn game of all time when it comes to the United States. So that absolutely just blew me away. I could have sat here and guessed, 100 different Sega Saturn games, and I don't think Madden 97 would have ever came off the tip of my tongue, but obviously football is very popular in the United States, and I think this just sort of proves it, especially considering this was a third-party game with so many awesome arcade games to choose from on the Sega Saturn. It looks like a lot of people gravitated towards Madden 97. So yes, that is the top 10 best-selling Sega Saturn games of all time in the United States list. Let me know in the comment section down below what you think of this list. Are you surprised by anything? If you're not surprised by number 1, then I don't know what else would surprise you, but I was definitely surprised to see Knights in at number 2. Definitely a very deserving game because I absolutely love it. But thank you guys for checking out this video. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Like I said, let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. And as always, I will catch you guys on the next video. Later.